So I'm going to talk about models that can be used to assess the invasion risk of forest pests and also to assess the effectiveness of pest management. So just a quick slide to recall the context and the outline. So as you know, the biological invasion can be divided in several steps: transportation of infested material, introduction of the forest pests or pathogens, establishment, spread, and impact. Here I'm going to talk about models that can be used to describe potential introduction, establishment, and spread of forest pests. So forest insects, but also sometimes forest pathogens, but I will mainly focus on insects, and also pest management. And I will end by some perspectives. So first, regarding probability of entry. So a few years ago, I worked with some colleagues from Wageningen University in the Netherlands, notably with Wopke van der Werf and Bob Dumar, but also other colleagues. And we reviewed papers, studies that in which the authors developed some pathway models to describe the probability of entry of alien species. And we found 23 papers. And in fact, there are a wide range of models that can be used to describe the probability of entry. These models can consider a flow of infected products, or they can follow guardians, so the forest insect of the pathogens. They can be stochastic, or with random realization, or deterministic. They can consider nodes differently. Either the nodes are real geographical locations, for instance, the port of Bordeaux, or it can represent just the function, so a port. The probability of introduction can be expressed as an absolute value or as a relative value, and so on. But in fact, most of the papers consider a flow of infested products in a deterministic way. So don't worry, I'm not going to enter into too many details about equations. So so my colleagues from Wageningen, we had a project with EFSA a few years ago, and we developed a generic probabilistic model to assess exposure of trees. We have the thread of wood, and then we applied the generic model to two case studies. The first one is the oak-wilt disease. I'm going to talk a little more about this, and about the pine wood nematode. But so now I'm going to describe more generally this generic probabilistic model. We consider that some infested wood can arrive in the European Union, so either roundwood or sawnwood. It enters in a port where there's an inspection. Then it is sent to wood factories to be transformed. And we follow the chain until the final product and the consumption. And in fact, along all this chain, the forest pest or pathogen can have a possibility to escape. So here, that's the same, but on the scheme. So we start in the country of origin. We consider the infestation level of the forest there. Then we have a given probability to survive, that the pest survive to the treatments there. It can be transformed. It can have a given probability to survive to first transformation if we import soundwood. Then soundwood or roundwood. If you see my mouse, then the wood enters in a port where the given probability of being detected or not detected. Then it is transported within the European Union, and then it is sent to wood factories to be transformed, and it goes until the consumer. And we identify 5 main nodes. So it has a possibility to enter at entry ports during transportation within the European Union, from roundwood and sawwood in wood factories, and from wood residues in wood factories, and at the end from final products. And at each node, we calculate the probability of transfer, which is the probability that the pest can escape, given the infested volume, by the probability that it disperses, by the probability that it encounters a host given the host cover around and the dispersal capability of the pest. And we feed this model with important quantities of wood, and we retrieve this data from Eurostat. But as someone already said, I think we have very large classes, so it's not easy to have very precise data. And this model involves many parameters. There are 21 parameters characterizing the wood processing, and wood trade. So, for instance, wood density, because from Eurostat we have a tonnage, and we need here a volume. We need to consider the flow of wood among European countries, the proportion of wood with bark, and so on. And of course, the spatial distribution of host trees. We also have 24 pest-specific parameters. For instance, the proportion of infested wood in the country of origin, the pest survival to treatments, the probability of detecting the pest at entry, the probability of escape, probability of dispersal, and the mean dispersal distance. So in fact, there are a lot of parameters, and most of them with high uncertainty. So we cannot estimate a real absolute probability of introduction, but we can estimate a relative probability. And this model can be useful to compare scenarios, to compare probabilities at various nodes, whether the probability of introduction is higher near the ports of entry or near wood factories, for instance. And we can also compare this probability in various countries or various regions. And also, importantly, we can also use this model to compare some management scenarios. And this is what we have done with the oak wilt disease. So we applied this generic model to the pathogen responsible of the oak wilt disease, which is Brezzelia fagacearum. And in fact, there are European Union regulations for oak logs coming from the US and entering in the European Union. In fact, we can import oak logs from the US under 3 options. We can import logs of red or white oak with or without bark, but these logs should be fumigated. So this is the option bark fumigated, BF. So the second option is to import logs with white oak only, because it is less susceptible to the disease, with or without bark, that are not fumigated. And so in this case, red oaks, which are more susceptible, are excluded from this import option. And the third option is to import red or white oak logs without bark. So you can see on the figure on the left the results. So the average exposure of European tree between 2001 and 2009. So please note that the y-axis is on a logarithmic scale. And I've considered a fourth scenario here, where this is a hypothetical scenario without regulation. So we can see, and yes, and the figure in the center is the same, but showing the variability among the years. So we can see that existing regulations can reduce exposure by a factor of more than 30,000 compared with a scenario without regulation. So now I'm going to shift to the next stage, which is potential establishment. In fact, establishment includes several processes: survival, development, reproduction. And establishment is mainly based on 2 factors: climate conditions and host trees. So some models can use some temperature thresholds, and these thresholds are usually defined using based on a mix between large-scale correlation and experimentations. So here, this is a well-known case study. This is where the northern limit of the species distribution of Dendroctonus frontalis in the US can be defined by the isoline corresponding to an annual probability of 0.9 of reaching minus 16 degrees. And in France and in Europe more generally, we have shown that the northern limit of the pine processionary moths, Tomatopora pitiocampa, can be determined using the survival rate associated with the number of feeding days of the larva during the cold period. And in fact, we found that the mean of minimum temperature from October to March was a good indicator of this feeding activity and thus of the survival. In fact, a temperature of 3.3 degrees Celsius induces 50% of mortality. Then some models consider phenology of the species. So here is also a well-known case study. So this is the phenology model of the spongy moss, so Limiantria dispar. And so David Gray published this paper in 2004. And in fact, he assessed whether the spongy moss was able to complete its development all across the US. And then from this data, he was able to derive a climatic suitability index. But in fact, most of the models developed to assess the probability of establishment are based on ecological niche modeling and mainly on species distribution models. This is the most widely used method. And in fact, it consists in finding a correlation between the forest pest occurrence and environmental variables. For instance, climate. 19 bioclimatic variables are usually used, but they can also consider ostriches or other factors. But we should keep in mind that there's an important assumption behind this model. The species should be in equilibrium with its environment. So for invasive species, this is very tricky. We should really consider the area of origin as the training data set, at least, where it is supposed to be in equilibrium with its environment. And in fact, species distribution models are not a single model. It encompasses a large set of models, such as Maxent, Bioclim, or many others. So sometimes one model is used, but ideally, we should use some consensus methods. It means that we should apply different models and then combine them or select the results of several of them. But quite usually in papers, this is not very often done. Now I'm going to shift a little more about recent advances. So first, regarding species distribution models, so far they were applied to a species. But we know that there are some genetic clades. And for instance, this paper from Urwa and Al in 2023 consider the two genetic clusters of the Andros Xylosandrus crassularis. And in fact, these two genetic clusters that you can see on the map have diverging climate niches. And when they applied some climate change scenarios, they could find that cluster 2, which is present in Europe, could widen its distribution, while cluster 1, which is not currently present, because the climate is not so suitable, could invade Europe with climate change. And then we can combine the overlap then with the different models to have a good assessment of the potential establishment at the level of species. And here we are talking about one species, one forest pest or pathogen. But there are some interactions with other species. For instance, for the pinewood nematode, so there are plenty of species distribution models that have been developed for the pinewood nematode, so Drosophila nilophilus. But we know that there are some interaction with the insect vector of the genus Monocamus and ostriches. So some authors, Zhu et al., published a paper last year where they developed one species distribution model for the pinewood nematode, one species distribution model for each of the 13 Monocamus vectors all around the world, and one species distribution model for each of the 61 ostrich species, and then they overlap everything. So these were the recent advances in species distribution models, and now I'm going to talk about future direction, more generally about models that describe establishment. First, it seems so the activity of forest insect or pathogen may be restricted to a portion of the year, and survival and reproduction success may depend on the synchrony with other species, notably host trees. And we know that climate change can affect the phenology of insects or pathogens, and also affect the phenology of host trees. So, as it is said in this review from Ponti and Sanolo, it is very important now to consider to try to integrate phenology in species distribution models. And even this feature direction is also valid for any models describing establishment, not only species distribution models. Even when we're using a model considering a single temperature threshold, it is very important now to try to refine this, considering phenology, because, for instance, as I've said, with the fine positionary mode, we have shown that the mean of minimum temperature from October to March was a good indicator of the possibility of capability of establishment. And this was defined because this period is supposed to represent the conditions experienced by the most susceptible larvae, so L3 to L5. But we know that with climate change, the phenology of the species is changing. So while considering the temperature from October to March, if the larva has completed its development in December, for instance. So here I show the map. So this is the mean of minimum temperature from October to March on the left during the season 2021-22, so the winter. And on the right, this is the temperature experienced by L3 to L5. So you can see that temperatures are higher than expected, in fact. And so this is from the result from simulations, because we developed a phenology model for the fine positionary moss. So I've been able to determine the period of occurrence of these stages. And so as I've said, species distribution models are based on statistical relationships. So as any statistical model, they are valid in the range of observed data. But with climate change, we expect to have conditions never encountered so far. So it's quite dangerous to extrapolate to new conditions. So it seems that integrating more mechanistic processes in such models, notably to integrate species physiological constraints and survival rates, could help to increase the robustness of this model. So here, this is a preprint of Fenolosa and Ali this year, showing that mechanistic niche modeling can enhance our understanding of invasive species under changing environmental conditions. So regarding the stage of establishment, I'm not presenting so far the effectiveness of pest management. In fact, as I said, establishment is mainly based on two factors: climate conditions and host trees. And it seems difficult to act on climate and host trees, at least at short term. But we can act on propagal pressure, so it's rather linked to the probability of entry, and also early effects, so to decrease the population level under thresholds in this, so that the species can then go extinct naturally. So I'm not going to develop this further, but with models we can describe the effectiveness of mass trapping or so on. And so now I'm going to shift to the last stage I'm going to talk today. It is the potential spread. And in fact, this is really in the core of my expertise here. So spread can encompass dispersal, but also survival, growth, and reproduction. And in fact, there are two main dispersal components: insect-owned dispersal and dispersal due to accidental transportation of infested wood or tree. So first, I'm going to talk about insect-owned dispersal. So we can develop individual-based dispersal model at fine scale, so, following the trajectory of each insect, or population spread models at large spatial scale, considering a density of population. First, I'm going to talk about the first one, individual-based model. So we need to know the dispersal capability of forest pests or pathogens to inject in a model And this is not so easy, in fact. There are many methods, perhaps not so many, but there are several methods to record dispersal capabilities of forest insects or pests or pathogens. For instance, so this is a study done with my colleague Hervé Jacquel in INRAE Bordeaux, and on Molocamus gallo-provençalis, the European vector of the pine nematode. And he recorded some data on flight meals. Flight meal. So we attach the insect on the device, and the insect can then return, and we count the number of rounds it can do, and then we calculate the distance of the flight. So as you can guess, this is a flight performance in very artificial conditions. And we believe that we may overestimate the real dispersal distance because the insect do not need to carry its own weight; it is attached. Then the other method that we use is the mark release recapture data experiment. So we released. So my colleagues released some insects, and then there were some traps all around, and and in fact, in this case, we can retrieve an interception distance, not really a dispersal distance. And we believe we can thus underestimate the real dispersal distance. So finally, it is quite difficult to have a good idea of the dispersal capability of the insect. So a few years ago, I think it was published in 2019, we combined both data sets. In fact, the data from the flight meal experiment were used to shape the probability distribution of flight distances. So I mean, this was used to know the proportion of long-distance flights versus the proportion of short-distance flights. Then we use this kernel, so this probability distribution, to simulate the mark release recapture experiment. And then we wanted to fine-tune the parameters to estimate more precisely the mean dispersal capability. And in fact, we found that even if at the beginning we thought that the value of the dispersal distance were different between the two experiments, in fact, they were completely in agreement. In fact, we even didn't have to fine-tune the parameters because we found relatively correctly the reception rates found on the field. And in fact, we found that the mean dispersal capability, the daily mean dispersal capability of Molocamus was 2,000 meters. And you can see that this negative exponential kernel nicely fitted the data. So the individual base model consists in selecting at random a direction, because we're supposed to be in a non-fragmented pine forest. So there's no reason to select one direction more than another one. And we select the distance following the dispersal kernel. And then we can simulate the trajectory of each beetle. So each dot represents a beetle, and each line represents its trajectory. So with this dispersal model, we then we thought it would be a nice tool to explore the effectiveness of the European regulation regarding the pine nematode, because there's among all the methods mentioned in the European regulation, there's a clear cut at a radius of 500 meters from an infested ostrich. So we simulated this, and in fact we simulated the effect of clear cutting with a radius varying from 0, so no clear cuts, up to even 40 kilometers. And you can see here, so here this is the current European regulation. This is a clear cut of 500-meter radius. And in fact, we can see that we can reduce the number of pine nematode transmission by only 11.5% at best, because we consider several scenarios. So in fact, this measure is fully successful, but in our under our assumption, and here we were supposed to be in a non-fragmented pine forest, such as L'élan de Gascogne, which is the biggest maritime pine plantation forest in the European Union. And in fact, we show that to be effective, this clear cut should have a radius between 14 and 38 kilometers, which is obviously not realistic to represent, to remove nearly all the forests. So then we wonder, so if clear cutting is not very efficient, what would be the solution? So still with our colleague from Wageningen, but also Hervé Jactel and Manuela Branco from Portugal, and also with Anju Sanch, I think she's here today. We compared two scenarios, clear cutting and 3x3 selective cutting. And this is in fact an ongoing study that should be submitted very soon to Ecology Letters. And we found that eradication of the pine wood nematode is possible, but only with intensive aerial surveillance, and provided that nearly all infested trees showed symptoms, because we know that for the pine wood nematode, there's a period of latency. So we can miss some infested tree. But then we also found that selective cutting tree could reduce the cost compared to clear cutting. And eradication is unlikely under suboptimal conditions. So it seems that if we cannot eradicate the pine wood nematode, then selective clear cutting would be a more realistic and cost-effective approach. But here I just recall that we are still in the context of a non-fragmented pine forest, and we are in an heterogeneous landscape. It may be different. And so our current questions regarding this study is, what is the behavior of the insect vector in heterogeneous landscapes? And how could we infer a flight resistance according to the land cover, and how to include this type of parameter in such dispersal model? So this is an ongoing work. So Anju was a PhD student in Wageningen University, and now she's a postdoc with me in my lab. So this is an ongoing work that we are doing also with Hervé Jactel. So then I'm going to shift to a larger scale, to population spread models. And in this case, so when we are talking about spread, so at large scale, large spatial scale, but also most often also at more temporal scale, because here it was just, with monogamy study, it was just a matter of one flying season. So we should consider dispersal, but also establishment and growth of the population. One very famous type of model describing dispersal and growth is the reaction diffusion model, because it can nicely mimic random walks and growth, population growth. And in fact, depending on the question we have, so there are different models, dispersal and spread models that can nicely describe dispersal, but not the effect of climate change on survival, for instance. Establishment model can nicely estimate establishment with and changes, potential changes with climate change, but not assess, it cannot take into account dispersal. And perhaps the most important line is missing. In fact, what would be the best is the model that can describe the three factors: dispersal, establishment, notably taking into account climate change, and the growth of the population. And this is somehow what we try to do with the range expansion of the pine processionary moth in France. So, as I said, we have already this survival function, depending on the mean of minimum temperature from October to March. Then we applied a diffusion model to describe the dispersal of the individuals, and a logistic growth of the population. And with this model, we have been able to show that climate warming was the main driver of the pine processionary moth expansion in France. And so, because I did some simulation with real weather data, and with data representative of the weather in the past. And with this historical temperature, we can see that the pine processionary moth was not able to expand. So this model was useful to assess the role of climate warming, but it is not so far it has not a very high level of prediction, because the model can make some errors in some regions. So this is still an ongoing work to increase the predictability of the results of the model. And as I said here, we plan to integrate phenology in this spread model. So far we. Oops, it has changed. Normally, F was it was the symbol of trees.
Yeah.
So far I presented models to describe the dispersal capability of the insect itself. But here I'm going to talk now about accidental transportation of system wood or tree. In fact, long distance jumps, so what we call stratified dispersal. So in fact, this type of dispersal it's not very frequent, and these are some stochastic events. So generally, it's quite difficult to have enough data to parameterize a model. And most often, human population density is used as a proxy to determine the arrival of a pioneer colony. So this was done for Camerharia oridella, Agrellus planipennis, for the pine wood nematode, and also for the pine positionary moss. And here, for the pine positionary moss, I played with climate change, and we can see, so each year there's a given number of potential long distance jumps, but always the same in this simulation model. And but what is changing is the temperature according to the year, and we can see that more and more long distance dispersal lead to high survival. So it means that if we observe more and more pioneer colonies, we don't know if this is due to a higher flow of infested material, or if this is due to a higher probability to establish far from the source population, or if this is a mix of both. And when looking for literature about accidental transportation of infested wood or trees, I found this nice paper of Givet and Sandy was also co-author of this paper, and they propose to assess accidental transportation. They propose to decompose this process in 3 steps: departure, transportation, and arrival. But here, this is just a thought. I'm just wondering, is human-mediated dispersal process is the same from one continent to another, for example, from China to Europe, or within the area of entry, for instance, within Europe? So this is the question I have in mind. I have no answer. So now I'm going to conclude with some take-home messages regarding entry. So we can use some pathway models, but there are still many unknowns. There are still many parameters that are difficult to estimate. And it's not possible to estimate an absolute value of the probability of entry, but we can use them to compare some scenarios. And we have still poor knowledge between the country of origin and the invaded countries. For instance, the time of travel, the conditions of travel in relation with insect phenology, development, and survival, and also the detection likelihood following the stage of the insect when it arrives. So it's possible to tweak some parameters to mimic regulation conditions, but these parameters are also difficult to estimate. So for the future, we need to collect more and more data and develop more knowledge about processes involved in human-mediated dispersal, and also about control procedures and their effectiveness. Regarding establishment, so most of the models are based on correlations. And we have very few levers, mainly to reduce propagal pressure and decrease the population under the least threshold to control these establishment steps. And regarding future directions, it's important to integrate a little more biological mechanisms to increase the robustness of the models, and notably to consider phenology and phenology change. Now, regarding spread, it seems that assessing dispersal capabilities and behavior in the field is not so easy, even if we have a range of methods already. And so we need to integrate the effects of heterogeneous landscape on dispersal, the dispersal difficulty, habitat preference, and so on. So this is regarding the insect dispersal. Then regarding human-mediated dispersal, stratified dispersal. It should be, we should develop this further, and we can perhaps question whether we should use the same framework as per human-mediated dispersal across continents or not. What is diverging? What is converging? Regarding management, I've shown that with this model we can compare various options and say whether this one is more effective than another. But we know that there are some new technologies now that are developing. So as we started to work on the penguin nematodes, so we already simulated that we can survey the infested trees using aircraft. But for instance, with remote sensing, with satellite images, we can imagine to test, to explore the effectiveness of many new options of surveillance and management. So, and last but not least, so far I mainly discuss about invasivity, so invasive threats of the species. But in fact, invisibility of the environment is also very important to determine the spread pattern and the invasion risk. We should consider the interactions with communities already present. So I think Eki talked about invisibility. So that's going in the same direction. So it was we would need to consider the trees, the community of trees, but perhaps not only, but even broader, the community of insects already there, occupying a niche, and so on. So I just wanted to tell that in our lab, a new researcher, a permanent researcher, will be hired, and he or she will arrive at the end of the year, and we'll work on this topic. So I think I finished. I just wanted to say thank you to Sandy for his invitation, and Jerry Hajek for the organization. And I would like also to thank all my collaborators. And just for French speakers, there's a book that has been recently published that I've coordinated about invasion and expansion of insect forest pests. What are the risks for French forests in the context of global change, with the contribution of 60 authors, and it is available in open access. So thank you very much.